Today we have Tom Burgis, investigative reporter at Financial Times. Thank you for joining us, Tom.
Thanks for having me.
You wrote a compelling book, Kleptopia. The title is amazing. It sounds like utopia, but utopia on the bad side of the story. What's Kleptopia? Is a lot of kleptocracies working together in a transnational way, or something more?
Yeah, that's really what it is. I mean, what do we mean by kleptocracy? We mean, I mean, um, a place or a system of power where corruption has become the main tool of power. So, in a free or a democratic country, or a country where the rule of law obtains, I think we would say that corruption is the anomaly. Corruption is the malady, right? And we try to have institutions that prevent corruption and expose it. And there's a sliding scale from the cleanest political system imaginable through to one that is completely dominated by corruption,
Yeah.
where the purpose of holding power is corruption. Power is sought in order to enrich the person who holds that power, and then corruption is used to maintain power through patronage and compromising state institutions. And on that sliding scale, I think if you look at a map of the world, what you see is that increasingly most of the world and larger portions of it are in the grip of kleptocracies, in the grip of political systems that serve the corrupt enrichment of those who hold power.
Do you think that we have
That's and
developed?
kleptopia is the
Yeah, sorry, no, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that kleptopia is the globalization of that. So kleptopia is in my mind, is what happens when kleptocrats start to unite, and I don't just mean dictatorships or the rulers of corrupt states. I also mean there are kleptocrats within multinational corporations, there are kleptocrats within law firms, and so on. What we're talking about is transnational, supranational networks of power that extend all around the world, from the bastions of democracy into the most terrorized parts of the worst kleptocratic countries, and these networks are growing, and as I show in the book through the 4 stories I tell in the book, they're becoming more and more entrenched and more interwoven.
Not all the kleptocracy are the same. And do you think that we have democracies suffering from kleptocracy?
Yeah, it's perfectly possible to have a kleptocratic democracy, if you like. I mean, I'd say Nigeria is quite a good example of one of those. There's sometimes there are some things about democracy that make corruption worse. So, in a very tightly controlled authoritarian kleptocracy, power is maintained through brutality and fear, which is obviously hideous for anybody living there. But one of other consequences of that is that you don't have to bribe so many people, because you just put them in jail or kill them. Whereas a system like Nigeria, which is ostensibly a democracy, and I think there's states in Europe you could apply some of this to as well. There, because of this kind of pantomime of freedom, if you like, massive amounts of money are required for the to bribe your way into maintaining control of an electoral system, a system in which there's electoral competition. So essentially, corruption in a democracy can be much more expensive because you don't have other tools, and that just obviously leads to greater demand for corrupt deals. And it's why in a country like Nigeria, where I lived for a few years, I'm very fond of, but it's corrupted from top to bottom. But that's this kind of terrible combination of an electoral system with oil-fueled corruption. And you're right to say it's different from, say, the corruption in Saudi Arabia or North Korea. It's a different thing.
don't you think that there is a kind of hypocrisy speaking about Western countries? For example, in terms of financial systems, I'm thinking about the UK financial systems, the USA financial systems, which are totally legal systems fueled by dirty money.
I mean, yeah, I'm not gonna. I mean, that's the core of the book. I tell these stories. It's written like a thriller, you know. The idea is to show the human beings and the pressures on human morality, if you like, within corrupt systems. And it's absolutely true that corruption is colorblind. Okay, corruption takes hold wherever there's human frailty and human greed, which is to say everywhere. And the institutions that we create to stop ourselves falling prey to corruption are themselves corrupted or weakened or otherwise destroyed, or as in many post-colonial countries, were never there in the first place. And I absolutely agree with you that corruption, the engines of corruption, are just as much New York and London as they are Moscow or Luanda, let's say. But what's so important to understand is the different tools that kleptocrats in these different places bring to their networks of power. So what the Zimbabwean kleptocracy brings to its networks is control of a state, the ability to award rights to natural resources to businesses, and access to state instruments of power and coercion, so the military and intelligence agencies. So that's the tools that you bring if you capture a Zimbabwe or a Belarus or a Bolivia. Now, what are the tools? But those tools aren't sufficient. Okay, they would have been once for a sort of self-contained kleptocracy, but as kleptocracy has got more global, what's happened is that a remarkable thing, and in the book, I think you see it most strikingly with Kazakhstan, this extraordinary country, huge country between Russia and China, is what the West can offer to people like the Kazakh kleptocracy is the ability to detach themselves from the truth of how they hold power and the self-enrichment that they conduct. In the same way that you might use a front company to disguise a corrupt deal, they can use kind of essentially it's like political front companies, right? They can move their money into places where it enjoys property rights. They can hire lawyers in countries where the rule of law obtains, and they can use the rule of law to advance their own lawlessness, essentially. And really crucially, they can use political lobbyists. They can use propagandists, public relations firms, to conduct information laundering and reputation laundering. And that's not just because they want people to say nice things about them, although invariably they do. It's so important because as they gain a veneer of legitimacy, thinking about people like Nazarbayev in Kazakhstan, but there are many others who have tried to do this. Kabila in Congo is a good example. There are many more. By hiring former prime ministers and former oil ministers, and by having their oligarchs donate to universities and charitable foundations.
The storytelling. They reshape their truth.
They reshape the stories. Well, storytelling is the perfect word to use, and that's where I come down to at the end of the book, and that's why I try to tell the book like this through the narrative techniques of a novelist to show that. I mean, obviously, every word of it is true, and there's massive amounts of footnotes for anyone who wants to get right down into the detail. But it's not just a stylistic decision. It's also very important for us to understand that what's really happening is a war to tell the story, and to control the narratives that govern how we all live. The great narratives of religion, of politics, of business. These shape our lives, and there's a real connection between the spread of kleptocracy and the destabilization of the truth. Because money laundering, that's what money laundering is essentially is. Corrupt money is laundered by removing its truth and creating a new one. And that's a linked process to the destabilization of the idea of the truth itself that everyone from Putin to Trump is so actively engaged in.
Following your book, it really seems that the fall of the Berlin Wall was really a kind of divide between generations. It was a really a new beginning for kleptocracy. Why, in your opinion?
When the British Empire collapsed, the assets, if you like, of that empire were very widely dispersed into a great many independent nations, often with ultra corrupt elites that had been created by the imperial power to, and this goes for the other European empires too, elites that were deliberately created to fuse economic and political power. That's how the European empires maintain control over so many countries, right? By doing exactly the opposite of what they were trying to do at home. At home, you want to separate economic power and political power. All the scandals in politics are about when those two things blur. But if you want to control Gabon and you're in Paris, you do that by creating a little client elite who control economic and political power in the same people. Now, when the imperial powers leave, those elites continue to hold that power, and that is, if you wanted to design a country that was going to be corrupt, that's how you'd set it up to start. Now, when the Soviet Empire finished, it's true that obviously some independent nation states developed, but they were much more tightly knitted together through the old Communist Party networks. And also then what happened was the most immense and concentrated transfer of wealth maybe that we've ever seen from the state to private individuals, many of whom we now call the oligarchs. But as we see in brilliant books like Catherine Belton's book, Putin's People, she's an old colleague of mine, what was happening was that a kleptocratic network was essentially transferring the assets of an entire empire to its own control, Putin's network. That process through the 90s was on such a scale that it introduced a new tidal wave of money to the global kind of aquifer of corruption, if you like. There's always been dirty money flowing out of Congo or wherever it may be. But this just absolutely turbocharged that process of the money that was flowing, that was being seized in the former Soviet Union. And then, of course, what happened was, on the same scale, that money started to move into the West, as we've discussed, to seek the protection of the rule of law, to seek and to seek a kind of haven. But what we're only recently discovering, and why it's so important, is that it wasn't just money that was flowing. That money, when it arrived in the West, started to have a corrosive influence. It started to corrupt political power. It started to work through lobbying systems. It started to touch everything from universities to charity to the art market, and to distort it, because that money was also advancing, if you like, the kleptocratic cause as it went. And too late, we have started to realize that dirty money that we in the West hoovered up quite happily without thinking that really it had any consequences, or indeed that it had any victims. We're realizing that there are victims both where that money left. I'm thinking of the long and growing list of poisoning victims in Russia, and where the money arrives. I'm thinking of dead witnesses in corruption cases. I'm thinking of the general undermining of the institutions of democracy. And that's why it's an absolutely, this question of the spread of kleptocracy is existential to the rule of law states.
How mafia, in your opinion, mafias, I'm thinking about Italian mafia, but we have Russian mafia, Albanian mafia, different. How mafias can interact with kleptocracy? What kind of role they can play? They are just tools, or another side of the kleptocracy?
I mean, sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. I think the line between kleptocracy and organized crime is very blurry, and sometimes it's unhelpful to separate these two things. I mean, in the book, I write a fair bit about Semyon Mogilevich, who's one of the great dons of the Russian mafia. He's Ukrainian himself, but of the, let's say, the ex-Soviet mafia. He's the kind of the dirty money man, a genius, as like a kind of criminal banker, essentially, but also plugged into the most horrifying parts of organized crime. And he we're led to believe by defectors from Russia, has been an asset for decades of Russian intelligence and has relationships with some of the most powerful people in Russia who run the Russian kleptocracy. So the idea that there's one category, which is mafia, and another category, which is kleptocrats, I think is a mistake. These blur, and you can see in the kind of 70s and 80s and 90s in New York, where organized crime was starting to become more cosmopolitan and to globalize. You can see the roots of some of the kleptocratic globalization that follows. You can see how I write in the book about how the Italian mafia in New York and the Russian mafia more recently arrived in New York, started in the 80s to form these joint ventures, and they were largely to do with fuel scams, like bootleg car fuel, vehicle fuel scams. But that led to much wider cooperation, and you can see in it, and I show in the book, you can see in those networks that were formed then that a lot of characters come out of that network and into the world of sort of blurred crime, politics, and business, in which the major figures of the global kleptocratic networks often have their roots. I'm thinking most strikingly of Donald Trump, who's deeply, profoundly linked to this world of where organized crime mixes with kleptocratic politics and ultra opaque areas of business, especially real estate.
In your book, you tell the stories of a lot of characters. One of them is Felix Sater.
Felix is a fascinating man. So yeah, as you said, this, I tried to the stylistically the model for the book. There are a few of them, but one, the greatest non-fiction novel that's ever been written is In Cold Blood by Truman Capote, and there are other magnificent works like Nothing to Envy by Barbara Demick about North Korea is magnificent, and Michael Lewis obviously does this fantastically, and there are Three Women by Lisa Taddeo last year was phenomenal, and so I was, and you're right that there's a large cast of characters, and this is a global and complex world, but I've tried to tell it through these four stories. One, Nigel, a British banker. There's Peter Salas, idealistic Canadian lawyer. There's Sasha Mashkevich, an oligarch from the former Soviet Union. And then, yes, there's Felix Sater. And these stories interweave around the world and get closer and closer to the kind of pinnacles of power. Felix is fascinating. He comes from the world we've just been talking about. You know, he's Russian-born, Brooklyn-raised, gets entangled in organized crime after going to jail for stabbing a guy in the face in a bar with a broken martini glass, I think, or margarita glass. I'll have to check my own notes there, but certainly a cocktail glass. And Felix then becomes involved in using his financial talents. He's worked on Wall Street, using his financial talents to launder money for an Italian mafia-backed scam, boiler room scam, like a stock shares equity scam. But before he gets caught or gets found out, he goes to Russia. He builds contacts with Russian intelligence. He told me he was recruited to American intelligence in the toilet of a restaurant in Moscow. It's an extraordinarily colorful story involving Felix getting hold of Osama bin Laden's satellite phone numbers and so on, and seeming to be able to maintain astonishing relationships simultaneously with Russian intelligence and US intelligence. And he is really a character of our time, someone who can move between these worlds. And where does he end up? He ends up in US real estate. And who's his business partner? Donald Trump. And Felix, I think, is extraordinary mercurial character. And I think, and he's obviously at the heart of the discussions during the Trump candidacy in 2015 and 16 about building a Trump Moscow. He's at the absolute heart of these questions about the extent to which Russian kleptocracy, that is getting personal financial gain from political activity, whether that the extent to which that permeated the Trump candidacy and the Trump presidency. And by seeing how Trump came out of that world, by seeing how Trump in business, failed businessman that he was sustained for so long by money from the great kleptocracies, not just through Felix Sater, but also through other figures linked to organized crime and linked to major economic interests in the big kleptocracies of the former Soviet Union. How they just sustained Trump for so long, and it seems to me that to understanding people around him like Felix Sater, you can see how. For me, I think it's unlikely that there is somewhere in Vladimir Putin's sock drawer a folder of pictures of Trump cavorting with prostitutes on a bed in a hotel somewhere. It's possible. I certainly wouldn't rule it out. But I also think that that's not necessary for us to see Trump as being in thrall to kleptocracy for two reasons. One is he was, as I show in the book, he was sustained by kleptocratic money for so long that he knows where his bread is buttered. He knows who his business allies are. You mentioned the Mafia earlier. This is exactly how the Mafia work. By it's often subtle. It's by letting you know where your interests lie, where your commercial interests lie,
Exactly.
and using that to exert pressure on you. And then, of course, Trump comes into office, and what happens? First of all, he tries to pretend he's never known Felix Sater, but also then he governs like a kleptocrat. His allies are the major kleptocrats. The people he naturally allies with, whether that's in North Korea or Israel or Russia or Hungary or Brazil. These are people who we may describe as nationalists or even neo-fascists, but really what's going on is that they're entrenching kleptocracy in their countries. And everywhere you entrench kleptocracy, you need another way to generate loyalty, right? And often you do that through nationalist rhetoric. And that's the world Felix came out of, and that's the world Trump came out of. And it's how I think we should best understand what's just happened in America for 4 years.
Yeah. To end up our interview, two questions. What is the human cost of Kleptopia? And what can we do? What, as a citizen, we can do to...
Can I read you a paragraph from the book to
please.
answer your question about the human cost? So in the center of the book is the most harrowing story of all, which is the story of Rosa Tulatieva, who is a woman who lives in Kazakhstan, middle-aged, single mother, lives quite a tough life. She works in the Kazakh steppe, essentially a desert, pretty godforsaken place where Kazakhstan pumps its oil, the proceeds of which sustain the Kazakh kleptocracy. And Rosa is a forceful character, and she just doesn't hold with the corruption that means the workers aren't getting what they deserve. So she joins a strike, and she emerges as one of the leaders of that strike in 2011. Now, strikes are not really tolerated in Kazakhstan. Very little is tolerated in Kazakhstan, and there's a great deal of pressure is put on the strikers, but they maintain their strike, and every day they hold a kind of vigil. They hold a picket protest in the main square in a town called Zanaozen, which is a remote, very remote place I managed to get to, and I describe in the book. And the way that strike is finally broken is when the Kazakh security forces open fire on the demonstrators, just shooting them dead in the square, about 12 of them. And then what they do is they start to destabilize the truth. Now, you can destabilize the truth with a cunning social media campaign, but there are also sort of more agricultural ways of doing it, and that the kleptocrats' favorite way of doing it is through torture. Through the ages, you torture to get a different version of reality, in it through confessions, false confessions. So Rosa presents herself shortly after the shooting at the main police station because she's heard the president say that there's going to be an inquiry into what's happened, and this fills her with hope. She thinks, okay, we're actually going to establish the truth. She arrives at the security agency's office in Zanozen. And this is what happens. Men in plain clothes walked Rosa into the detention center and down a corridor with doors leading off on each side. They led her to what she took to be a commander's office. There she was shown a list of her relatives. She was questioned again and again, men shouting at her, but she didn't understand what answers she was supposed to give. One of the men had a scar on his face and a malevolent air. Ruslan was his name. He came towards her carrying a plastic bag. He whipped it over her head and pulled it tight. She gasped for air, but none came. At last, Ruslan released the bag. Rosa felt her head swim. Then suddenly the bag was back on, her body writhing in panic. Again, Ruslan asphyxiated her, and again and again. When the bag split, he went off to find another. His colleague took over. He slapped Rosa's face, grabbed her neck. He seized a fistful of her hair and dragged her from her seat. When they took her back to her cell, she tried to tidy herself. As she composed her hair, a clump of scalp came away in her hand. Then we go on through the monstrous torture that's happening to other detainees, including sexual abuse, and to Rosa, and about how she's still living with the trauma of her friends being killed, how she's still being haunted by the ghosts of those who'd already died. And then I describe the moment arrived when fear took Rosa completely. And that's when they start to talk about her daughter and what they could do to her. She would have done anything to protect her daughter. She wanted to protect everyone. Others could betray her if they needed to, if it would keep them out of here. By any means, by truth or lie, let them not end up here, she thought. She would have done anything, but she did not know what it was she was supposed to do, to say. What had happened, she thought. And then a kind of show trial begins, and the Kazakh kleptocracy starts to recruit the great and good, including Tony Blair, to alter history essentially, and to give a different version from what actually happened. And if you go to Zano's, as I have, you can still establish the truth, but it's they've made a good effort to bury it. And Rosa is a victim of kleptocracy. We often think, and our sort of popular perception of corruption and kleptocracy is that the only real bad consequences of it is that people have yachts who probably shouldn't deserve them. But kleptocracy is violent because it breaks the contract between rulers and ruled, right? If you're in power to steal, you're not in power to steward the public good. Excuse me. And that means that you have to keep control by other means, whether that's poisoning and then jailing Alex Navalny, or it's doing what happened to Rosa, or it's the deaths of witnesses in corruption cases. The list is long, but the victims of kleptocracy, I would say, also include those who are unfortunate enough to be among the generations born to the most rapacious, no, maybe not the most rapacious, to the most kind of hardcore kleptocracies, which are the ones where there's not very much to go around. So I'm thinking of particularly the Central African ones. I talk about a deal in my, a set of business deals in my book that condemned Zimbabweans to spend another quarter of the average life expectancy under kleptocratic dictatorship. I've met children starving to death in Eastern Congo while the proceeds of that country's massive mineral wealth are siphoned off. The victims are very real. And then I think what can you do? What can we do about it? Was that question.
There is no way out, Henny.
Yes, there is. Of course there is. We can always fight. We can always resist. And actually, but the thing we must not do is look for some silver bullet that we have to invent. We know what to do. We know that the antidote to democracy is the rule of law. Our best defense against kleptocracy, is the rule of law. And that means strengthening the institutions of the rule of law. That means well-funded, especially well-funded, because they're up against incredibly well-funded adversaries, well-funded state law enforcement agencies, especially economic crime enforcement agencies. That's in the rich world, and
the cooperation.
Also, they must support they must support those in wherever they can. Cooperation is vital. The cross-border law enforcement system is badly broken, and it's politicized. I mean, especially institutions like Interpol, but also the mutual legal assistance treaty system doesn't work. We need independent, well-funded media, independent, well-funded legislatures. We know these things because we've built them up over a very long time, precisely to safeguard us against kleptocracy, which is just one form of tyrannical rule, essentially, of arbitrary rule. We know these things, and in in each of our little ways, we can surely think of ways to strengthen them and to stand up for them. And there are brilliant people coming up with, fascinating policy ideas and new legal tools. But I think also what we can all do is ask much stronger questions of our rulers about the extent to which they are on guard against dirty money, rather than using it to supplement their own political donations, and the extent to which they've understood that it is a malicious force undermining democracy itself. These are all questions we have to keep.
Follow the money, as you remind.
Follow the money.
Giovanni Falcone built all this work on follow the money, because if you follow the money, you can link the dots.
Yeah, and that's why financial transparency is so important. And there's been some good moves in that direction in the US recently, and there's much more that can be done. Essentially, it comes down to whether we think it's legitimate to use money anonymously. And I would argue that it never is, actually. Money is a token by which strangers can cooperate in large societies.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Tom.